Mr. Otway here to tell you about Anglo Saxon law and order, and the first thing I'm going to explain to you that you can get into your description is blood feuds and the Wehrgild. So the issue was that murder happened. Murder will happen in human society because there are some evil people around the place. And falling outs and all that stuff. And there's no police force in Anglo-Saxon time. If one person got murdered, very often what the family of the victim thought is it was their right to gain revenge over whoever they thought might have carried out that particular murder. So what they did was they did take revenge. But then the family that had revenge taken upon them, they would often then retaliate back to the family, and it would just go back and forth with fighting and killing and injuring, and it could be very, very damaging to society. So what they tried to do in Anglo-Saxon society is introduce something called the Wehrgild, and there was varying degrees of fine. A fine was the Wehrgild. For example, if you injured somebody's toe, it could be a fine of up to 10 shillings. If you killed an earl or a thane, 300 shillings. So it depended. There was no set, well, you're having a Wehrgild, give up with the blood feud. It was kind of up to individuals to decide how they were going to proceed. There was no set rules, and this is part of the problem with Anglo-Saxon law and order. At this time, it wasn't set in stone what would happen in every country. The other thing is, blood feuds and Wehrgild, they were mostly, the earldom in which this was most likely to happen was Northumbria. And if you're wondering about the hat, there's no reason at all. I just wanted to put a hat on. Next thing I'm going to tell you about is collective responsibility and tithings. So a tithing was a group of 10 people all put together, and they were supposed to be collectively responsible for the behaviour and conduct of everybody within their tithing. So imagine there's 10 of you in your class, or there's 30 of you. I think there's roughly 30 in your class. You divide them into 3, and because it's about 10 in each group. And each group of 10 people, if one person misbehaved, then it would be the responsibility of the other 9 people to hand that person into the sheriff, the thane, somebody who could judge upon them and give them a punishment. If they didn't, and it was suspected of the tithing that somebody in that group had behaved irresponsibly, had done a crime, committed something, then all 10 would be punished. And that was supposed to encourage them to tell on other people, you see. So this is a tithing, a group of 10 people, all collectively responsible for each other's behaviour. And there we go. Also, a point which I nearly forgot to say, is if you were part of a jury judging on a particular case, it's likely that you would be in the jury if the person being accused was in your tithing, because you're supposed to know them well. If you're wondering about the wig, this isn't a wig. This sometimes happens on a Friday with my hair. What can you do? Good evening, comrades. This one I'm going to tell you about is the hue and cry. So, as I've said, there's no police force. There's usually one sheriff who's supposed to judge on crimes. We've got the tithings, we've got collective responsibility. But if there's a crime actually going on, who's going to do anything about it? Well, if you saw a crime, it was your duty to raise the hue and cry. H-U-E and cry. Which was basically go, there's a crime going on, everybody come running. And everybody's responsibility, if they heard the hue and cry, was to go to wherever that person was shouting. If you saw a crime going on and you didn't raise the hue and cry, then you would be in deep trouble. If you heard the hue and cry and you didn't go, you would also be in deep trouble. In both instances, you would be punished. So it was your responsibility to raise the hue and cry, so everybody went running and tried to deal with what was there. It's a kind of another example of collective responsibility. Everybody's responsible for law and order. There's not one force in the country which is responsible, because there was no police force, as we've said. So that's law and order, hue and cry. How? The most serious of all of the crimes that could be committed in Anglo Saxon England was treason. This is plotting against the king in one form or other, or doing something to betray your king and country. And the king would often judge on trials to do with treason, and he'd have to be quite harsh with his punishments. The king would very rarely judge on crimes. Usually if it was a really serious crime involving somebody important, like an earl or a particularly wealthy thane, other than that, he let other people deal with those things. So that's treason. And if somebody was accused of a crime, there were not one, but two different ways you could put somebody on trial. The first was trial by jury, where you have people on the jury. This is supposed to represent people. Well, let's do. Here we go. Here's the jury. Here's the jury. This water bottle stands accused of stealing. Didn't do it. These guys have got to decide. Oh yes, come in. We've got a visitor. Hello, miss.
Hello.
I'm just making a video.
I thought you were.
It's alright. We'll return to the trial shortly. So anyway, we were up to the accused and the jury. The jury had to decide if he did it. I didn't do it. And if they couldn't decide, they had another option. But usually they would decide. There'd be a unanimous decision. Yes, he did it. No, he didn't. If he did, he'd get a punishment, and that'd be the end of that. That's trial by jury. These are the people in the jury. They were probably in his tithing. And the other option, if they couldn't decide, or if they wanted to choose a different option, would be trial by ordeal, which is where they got God to decide for them. They tried to get a message from God to help them say whether this person was guilty or innocent. And you've got to remember, that seems a bit ridiculous to us maybe now, but at the time people 100% believed in that they were going to heaven or hell after they died, and that there was a God controlling things that were going on earth, and they really believed that God would send them a message. So a trial by ordeal, it would often involve getting the person accused's hands, putting them in boiling water, and then wrapping them up for a couple of weeks. After a couple of weeks, they'd unwrap them, and if the hands were healing nicely, without blood and pus and also without the pus and all the things like infection, then that was God saying, this guy, he's innocent. If the hands were all like looking horrendous, they weren't healing nicely, there was infection and all sorts in the hands, then that's God saying, this person, they did it. And that would be it. That would be the judgment. The person would get punished or not based on what they thought was God's judgment. What we know was the judgment of cleanliness and germs. But that was what they went for. So, you should be able to write a description of Anglo-Saxon law and order, including blood feuds, vergild, tithings, collective responsibility, hue and cry, trial by ordeal, trial by jury, and treason.